Welcome to the debate. So if I spend 10 years studying a million different paintings, synthesizing their use of light, color, and composition to paint my own original masterpiece, well, society calls me a genius.
Right, absolutely.
But if a machine does the exact same thing computationally in like 3 seconds, is it a pirate?
Well, that assumes the machine is actually studying in a way we can legally recognize, which is exactly where the friction lies.
Exactly. We're looking at a landscape right now where generative artificial intelligence, models like Midjourney, DALL-E, Flux, they have ingested billions of copyrighted images.
Billions of them, yeah.
And yet, if you pry open these algorithms, there's no archive. Nothing is actually stored or held in a traditional sense. So what we have is this massive collision between the statistical pattern synthesis of generative AI and the foundational principles of United States copyright law.
It's essentially the most significant legal and, honestly, philosophical gray area of our lifetime.
It really is. And the central question we are exploring today is whether the ingestion of these copyrighted images to train AI models constitutes fair use under U.S. copyright law, or if it represents a mass systemic infringement.
Right.
We are going to ground this discussion in the mechanics of AI art, the statutory framework of the fair use doctrine, and the deeply fractured judicial precedents we are seeing right up to early 2026.
And just to lay our cards on the table, I'll be arguing that the resulting AI models act as direct commercial market substitutes that fundamentally fail the fair use test, posing, frankly, an existential threat to the original creators whose work was harvested entirely without consent.
And I will be taking the position that AI model training is a highly transformative process, firmly protected under fair use, essentially a sophisticated form of data mining.
Well, let's jump right into the core of the fair use doctrine then.
Yeah, let's do it. In U.S. copyright law, judges look at 4 main factors to decide if borrowing material is legally acceptable. For me, the whole argument hinges heavily on the very first factor, which is the purpose and character of the use.
Okay.
Basically, are you transforming the original work? Does it add something new, or does it just, mechanically replace it? I look at precedents like the Authors Guild versus Google case, or the HathiTrust case.
Right, the Google Books cases.
Right, so Google digitized millions of copyrighted books without permission. The author sued, naturally, but the courts established that mass digitization was in fact fair use.
But for a very specific reason.
Yes, because Google didn't just reproduce the books to sell cheaper copies. They transformed the text into data to create a completely new tool, a searchable metadata index. And I argue generative AI is doing the exact same thing.
I just don't see how creating an image generator is the same as a search index.
Well, because it doesn't store a database of JPEGs, it's not a zip file. During training, the neural network extracts abstract mathematical relationships, like how pixels relate to each other, the geometric rules of human aesthetics.
Okay, but
It uses that data to create entirely new, non-infringing synthetic media, what we sometimes call synthography. Because it extracts math rather than expressive content, it is, I think, the ultimate transformative use.
But hold on, those Google Books cases are fundamentally different. I come at this from a different way because you can't just isolate the first factor and ignore the rest of the statute. You have to look at the fourth factor.
Which is the market impact.
Exactly. The effect of the use upon the potential market for the original work. The Supreme Court has repeatedly highlighted market impact as arguably the most critical element of fair use.
Sure, but
Let me just finish this thought. When Google digitized those books, they created a metadata search engine, right? They did not create a machine that writes competing novels. Generative AI models, however, are producing direct artistic outputs that compete in the exact same commercial markets as the ingested works.
But that's an assumption about the technology's application, not its underlying mechanism.
I have to disagree. It is a measurable reality of the market right now. If you're an independent commercial artist listening to this, you know exactly what I mean. Look at the U.S. Copyright Office's 2025 report.
The one where they express skepticism?
Deep skepticism, yes. They looked at this exact argument and explicitly warned that AI training might not qualify as transformative fair use. They focused heavily on the commercial aspect.
Right, the commercial substitution.
Build a machine that supersedes the object of the original
and serves as a market replacement, it ceases to be fair use. It's piracy disguised as math.
I see why you think that, I really do. But let me give you a different perspective on how we actually define transformation. Let's put aside the cliche of the art student walking through a museum finding inspiration, because I know we both hate that metaphor.
We definitely do.
Instead, let's compare the machine to, say, a master culinary chemist.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine a scientist who takes 1 million copyrighted, highly guarded cake recipes. They don't copy the recipes to sell a competing cookbook. Instead, they mathematically map the exact chemical ratios of sugar to flour, the thermodynamics of baking, the molecular structures of flavor.
Right.
They synthesize the actual rules of baking to create an entirely new, synthesized food product. We wouldn't legally penalize the chemist for analyzing the data. The AI is doing that with visual aesthetics. It's learning the structural rules of lighting and geometry, not memorizing specific pixels.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that chemistry analogy. It's a clever framing, I'll give you that, but it's legally mistaken. Which is exactly what the 2025 Copyright Office report warned against. The machine doesn't have a subjective experience, it has no intentionality.
But does intentionality matter if the output is new?
It matters when we look at legal precedent for what actually counts as a transformative use regarding aesthetics. I mean, have you considered the 2021 Supreme Court decision in Andy Warhol Foundation versus Goldsmith?
Oh, you're talking about the Prince portrait case?
Precisely. For the listener who might not be familiar, Andy Warhol took a copyrighted photograph of the musician Prince, taken by a photographer named Lynn Goldsmith. Warhol imposed his signature high-contrast silkscreen style over it to create a new artwork.
Right, the orange Prince.
Exactly. And for a long time, the art world assumed that was automatically transformative because he added a totally new aesthetic layer. But the Supreme Court ruled against the Warhol Foundation.
Because of the licensing market, right?
Yes. They stated that merely imposing a new style or extracting and retaining the essential elements of a work is not transformative if the new work serves a competing commercial purpose.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Warhol's foundation licensed that silkscreen image to Condé Nast for a magazine cover, competing directly with Goldsmith's ability to license her original photo. The AI lacks a soul, yes, but its outputs are being used for the exact same commercial purposes as the inputs. The mechanism might be complex math, but the application fails the Warhol test spectacularly.
That's a compelling point, though I would frame the Warhol comparison quite differently.
How so?
Well, the Warhol case was about a specific, identifiable, one-to-one appropriation of a single photograph.
Warhol took Goldsmith's actual photo and painted over it.
The AI training process is not taking one photo of Prince and applying a filter.
True, it takes millions.
Exactly. It analyzes millions of images to understand the abstract conceptual math of a face, or a guitar, or neon lighting. Copyright protects specific expression. It explicitly does not protect abstract ideas, styles, or genres.
But the mechanism of that abstraction is fundamentally changing our relationship with reality, which absolutely matters legally. I want to bring in media theorist Johannes Grensfurthen here.
Okay.
He talks about this philosophical shift in terms of ontological disclosure. Think about what an image has historically been. Traditional photography has an indexical relationship to reality.
Meaning a physical trace.
Right. Light bounces off of a physical object in the real world, a person, an apple, a building, and it strikes a sensor or a piece of film. There is an unbroken causal chain between reality and the image.
Sure.
Generative AI fundamentally severs that indexical bond. It replaces physical reality with statistical pattern synthesis. Because generative AI lacks a camera lens, because it has no physical trace of the real world, it relies entirely on exploiting human intentionality.
By ingesting the training data.
Exactly. It is strip mining the millions of human choices captured in the training data to build a synthetic reality. Therefore, it is doing something parasitic in nature, and it cannot be conceptually shoehorned into traditional fair use.
I agree completely with your mechanical description of how it severs that indexical bond. I really do. But I arrive at the exact opposite legal conclusion.
Really?
Yes. The fact that the ontology of the image has shifted is exactly why it is fair use. It is the ultimate transformation. Let's actually look at how diffusion models, like Stable Diffusion or Flux, work under the hood.
Okay, let's look at it.
For anyone who thinks it's just a collage machine, it's not. You start with pure, random Gaussian noise. Imagine a television tuned to a dead channel, just static.
Right, just visual noise.
The model then iteratively removes that noise to reveal an image, guided by text embeddings. It literally hallucinates the image out of static by calculating the probability of where pixels should go based on the word, say neon.
Okay.
The output is so utterly divorced from the original indexical input that it cannot possibly be an infringement of any specific work. It is generating entirely synthetic data.
But you're assuming the outputs are always abstract, generalized representations of neon. This is exactly where the loss of that physical reality forces the AI to lean on the names of real, living people.
You mean the prompting?
Yes. This brings us back to the fourth factor, market substitution. Have you considered the reality of prompt engineering?
Of course. It's how users interface with the static you mentioned.
Right. But these platforms aren't just letting people prompt for abstract concepts. Because the machine has no physical connection to reality, users have to anchor the machine using key phrases like in the style of and then a specific artist's name.
Right, that does happen.
And it gets incredibly specific. People build entire open-source repositories of prompts designed to perfectly mimic living, working professionals. We joke about how hard it is to get these models to draw human hands correctly, but nobody jokes about how easy it is to type in an independent illustrator's name and completely usurp their livelihood.
Well, I wouldn't say usurp, but it is a disruption.
By conditioning diffusion models, or GANs, generative adversarial networks where two networks basically compete to forge the best possible image,
Right.
by conditioning them on specific artists, you directly cannibalize their commission market. If an art director needs a specific aesthetic, they don't hire the artist anymore. They just type the artist's name into Midjourney. The economic friction isn't abstract. It's a direct, measurable substitution of the original work's value.
I completely acknowledge the economic friction. It is highly disruptive, and artists are feeling real pain. But again, copyright law is incredibly rigid for a reason. It protects specific expressions, not abstract styles.
But the style is the value.
Ethically? Maybe? But legally, you cannot copyright a brushstroke. You cannot copyright the idea of drawing a futuristic city with a specific color palette. If I, as a human, study your portfolio and paint something in your exact style, I haven't infringed your copyright unless I duplicate a specific composition.
But scale changes the fundamental nature of the threat. A human might paint one homage a week. A server farm can generate 100,000 direct market substitutes in a second.
Scale doesn't change the underlying legal definition of what is copyrightable. Furthermore, let's look at history. Whenever a massively disruptive technology emerges, the incumbent industry insists it will destroy their market.
You're gonna bring up the VCR, aren't you?
I am. Think back to the Sony Corp versus Universal City Studios precedent in 1984. Universal sued Sony, assuming the Betamax VCR would absolutely destroy the film and television market because people could copy broadcasts in their living rooms.
The famous time-shifting defense?
Exactly. Jack Valenti famously testified to Congress that the VCR was to the American film producer what the Boston Strangler was to the woman home alone. That was the actual quote. That was the level of panic.
A bit dramatic, yes.
But the Supreme Court ruled that making copies for private time shifting was fair use. And furthermore, that Sony couldn't be held liable just because their machine could be used to infringe. And what happened? The Betamax didn't destroy Hollywood. It created the home video market, which became their most lucrative revenue stream.
But how does that apply to AI?
Generative AI is doing something similar. It isn't just substituting, it is expanding the pie. It's allowing amateur creators to build fast, non-commercial niche genres like solar punk visual novels. It's enabling fast prototyping for indie game developers who could never afford a concept art team. It is creating entirely new artistic capabilities that don't directly substitute a specific original work, but rather expand the total volume of visual media.
That's an incredibly optimistic argument, I have to say, but it completely ignores the fundamental legal fracture we are seeing in the courts right now.
You bring up Sony, but the courts today are totally divided on how to handle the mechanics of machine learning, which suggests the expanding the pie argument isn't really holding up under judicial scrutiny.
You mean the lower court rulings? Yes, the landscape is fractured, but look at the trajectory. Look at the 2025 Bartz versus Anthropic case.
Okay.
The judge there actually looked at the precise mechanics of how a large neural network processes data. They didn't just look at the output, they looked at the training phase, and they found the generative AI model to be a spectacularly transformative fair use.
I remember that phrasing.
Right? Why? Because mapping statistical relationships between tokens isn't a mechanical reproduction of the underlying work. The court recognized that analyzing data to learn its properties is fundamentally different from distributing unauthorized copies.
Okay, well, I'll see your bards and raise you the 2024 Thomson Reuters versus Ross Intelligence case.
Ah, the legal data one.
Yes. In that case, Ross Intelligence trained an AI model on Westlaw's proprietary legal data to create a competing product. The court explicitly rejected their fair use defense at summary judgment. Why did the judge rule that way? Because they recognized that replacing the need for the original work nullifies the transformativeness.
But that was a very specific database replacement.
It's the same principle. Just because the machine does complex math in the middle of the process, just because it turns text into statistical weights, doesn't excuse the fact that the input was unauthorized and the output is a direct market replacement. The math does not launder the theft.
Theft is a strong word legally.
And frankly, this brings us to the massive paradox at the heart of the AI industry's entire legal strategy. I know you're anticipating this.
You mean the copyrightability of the output?
Exactly. In 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, and then in early 2026 explicitly refused to hear an appeal on the matter, that AI-generated art is entirely ineligible for copyright. The law requires human authorship.
Yes, the Thaler case set the groundwork for that.
So look at the staggering hypocrisy of the tech industry here. How can companies stand in front of a judge and claim that the wholesale ingestion of human, copyrighted works is perfectly legal under fair use, yet simultaneously admit that the machine's output lacks the human authorship required to be protected?
I don't see that as a paradox at all.
They want to plunder the commons of human creativity for free, build billion-dollar commercial tools, and they are doing it by relying on a fair use doctrine that was historically designed to protect human criticism, human parody, and human scholarship.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the copyrightability of the output has absolutely no bearing on whether the training process is fair use. Those are two totally distinct legal moments.
How can you separate them?
Because fair use is evaluated at the moment the copyrighted work is utilized, in this case during the computational analysis phase on the servers. The fact that an AI cannot hold a copyright just means the output immediately enters the public domain.
Which floods the market.
And honestly, if anything, that serves the ultimate goal of the Constitution's copyright clause, which is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. By denying copyright to the outputs, we are generating an infinite, free public domain of synthetic media for all of humanity to use.
An infinite public domain built entirely on the uncompensated labor of millions of living artists. That isn't promoting the useful arts, it is ruthlessly extracting them.
Well, to summarize my position in light of our discussion today, while it is undeniable that generative AI violently tests the boundaries of our existing copyright law, interpreting its training phase as fair use is essential for technological progress and computational creativity.
I hear you, but I fundamentally disagree with the cost.
If we view this process through the established legal lens of data mining, focusing on the fact that these models extract abstract math, not expressive content, we protect the evolution of new synthetic media. We ensure that copyright law doesn't become a tool to stifle innovation simply because the statistical mechanics of machine learning are difficult to conceptualize compared to traditional copying.
And I maintain that stretching the definition of fair use to cover the wholesale ingestion of human creativity, specifically to build competing commercial image generators, violates the core balance that copyright was meant to strike.
The balance between creator and public.
Yes. It prioritizes the financial interests of the tech industry over the artists who provided the foundational value for these models in the first place. The human analogy fails, The market substitution is real and measurable, and the legal foundation regarding transformativeness is shaky at best when the output competes directly with the input.
I think the one area where we definitely converge is acknowledging that the legal landscape is currently deeply fractured.
Oh, absolutely.
The very definitions of what constitutes an authentic image, a market substitute, or a transformative act, they aren't just being debated in courtrooms. They are being actively rewritten by the math inside diffusion models.
Yeah, the technology is moving vastly faster than the jurisprudence. We are going to see these contradictions play out in the courts for years before we arrive at any kind of unified theory of generative copyright.
Which means it is up to all of us, creators, developers, and users, to observe these ongoing legal battles closely. We have to consider for ourselves where the line between inspiration and appropriation truly lies in the age of generative AI.
Agreed.
Because at the end of the day, when the physical trace of the copied text or the stolen object vanishes into the Gaussian noise of a neural network, we have to decide if the invisible extraction is still a crime, or just the architecture of the future.